The main tool of philosophical reasoning is the argument. Now, by an argument, we don't mean two people arguing with each other. That does sometimes happen in philosophy, but primarily what we mean by an argument is a series of statements or claims, some of which are offered as logical support for or as reasons for the others. The statements or claims that are being offered as support are called the premises of the argument. And the statement or claim that is being supported is called the conclusion of the argument. Last time we briefly discussed the following argument against hedonism. Hedonism, recall, is the view that the good human life, indeed the best human life, is the life that involves acquiring the most pleasure and the least pain across one's life. We discussed the experience machine thought experiment. I expect that many of you reacted to that thought experiment by saying, hey, I would not, if given this opportunity, plug into the experience machine. Nevertheless, if hedonism is true, then it would indeed be the very best thing for you. It would be living the good life to plug into the experience machine, because you could program it to give you the most pleasure and the least pain for the rest of your life. So what we saw was this experience machine thought experiment is both a standalone provocative piece of reasoning, but it also constitutes the core of an argument against hedonism. We could put that argument this way, and we'll return to this argument later in the course. If hedonism is true, then it would be good for me to plug into the experience machine. But it would not be good for me to plug into the experience machine. Therefore, hedonism is false. Now, I'll often represent arguments like this one that you might encounter in one of the readings in a premise-conclusion form. I'll put numbers next to the premises and next to the conclusion, and often separate the premises and the conclusion by a line. So here what we have is premise 1, if hedonism is true, then it would be good for me to plug into the experience machine. Premise 2 is it would not be good for me to plug into the experience machine. Conclusion, therefore, hedonism is false. 1 and 2 are the premises, and 3 is the conclusion. Some arguments are good, and some arguments are bad. So naturally, we should wonder, how can I tell the difference between a good argument and a bad argument? Here's the beginnings of an argument for a controversial conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist. So it's an argument against God's existence. This is one I've been working on for a little while. I think it's very promising. Let me write up the premises, and then I'm going to ask you to, as you watch this, consider as I go whether you think this is good or bad and why. All right, so here's the first premise of my argument against God's existence. UCF is in Indiana. All right, here's my second premise. Dogs are reptiles. So there's my argument against God's existence. Premise 1, UCF is in Indiana. Premise 2, dogs are reptiles. Conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. So have we just, owned all of the God believers? Are they weeping when they see this argument? Probably not. Obviously, this is a terrible argument against God's existence. The question, though, is why? And really, the answer, there are two answers. It's bad in two ways that, as we'll see, are separable. The first way that this is a bad argument is that there's no connection between the premises and the conclusion. The premises are just irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. we're going to try to formulate more precisely what that lack of connection is and also give a test for when it's present in a second. But just note that you can just see that this premise, UCF is in Indiana, and then the second premise, dogs are reptiles, just has nothing to do with the subject matter of the conclusion. In that sense, they are completely irrelevant to one another. The other obvious failing of this argument is that it has false premises. UCF is not in Indiana, and dogs are not reptiles. So if we were going to go about repairing this argument to make it a little better, one thing we might do is swap out those premises for true premises. So let's do that and see if we can improve the quality of our argument against God's existence. I sort of suspected that, you might not like this argument against God's existence, whether you're a theist or not. I suspected people might have concerns about whether it's a good argument. So what I have is a backup, and the backup, we'll call it argument B, two premises, and the same conclusion. Argument B starts like this. UCF is in Florida. Here's its second premise. Dogs are mammals. Therefore, God does not exist. I ask you the same question that I asked last time. Is this a good argument or a bad argument? And the answer obviously is it's still pretty crappy as arguments go. You can see that whether you accept the conclusion or not. So it's still bad. Notice though that it is better than the first argument in the following way. We now have true premises. UCF is in Florida, and dogs are mammals. Nevertheless, there's still no logical connection between those true premises and that conclusion. Again, the location of UCF and the classification of dogs as mammals is completely irrelevant to whether God does or doesn't exist. So in that way, what we have is still no connection between the premises of this argument and its conclusion. What we've just seen is that there are two conditions that an argument has to meet in order for it to be good. The technical word that logicians use for a good argument is sound, a sound argument. A sound argument is an argument that meets both of the following two conditions. A sound argument is both logically valid and has true premises. So the lesson from our little adventure with arguments A and B, our two bad arguments against God's existence, is this. In order for an argument to be sound, which is the word that logicians use to capture goodness or a good argument, it has to meet two separate necessary conditions. First, the argument has to be logically valid. The word valid, the way logicians use it and the way philosophers use it, is supposed to capture that idea of a logical connection between premises and conclusion. So sometimes colloquially, you might hear somebody say, oh, that's a valid point. Try your best to not use the word valid in that way while we're discussing arguments in philosophy class, because we are going to use the word valid to mean something more specific. Valid doesn't mean true, valid doesn't mean plausible. For us, valid is is a structural feature of an argument's form. It has a good logical form. Those premises are connected in the right way with the conclusion. That's what we mean by valid. I'm going to give you a more precise definition of validity in just a second. But a sound argument has to be both logically valid and have true premises. What we saw is that argument A failed both conditions. Argument B met the condition of having true premises, but failed the condition of being logically valid. Both arguments are unsound. So what this illustrates is that soundness requires the meeting of both of these two conditions. Now, I mentioned that the word valid, the way we'll be using it, is the name of a good or tight logical form. There's a sufficiently robust connection between the premises and the conclusion. I'm going to now give you a more technical definition of validity. I'm actually going to give you two. The two definitions are logically equivalent. You should know them both. You should know them both because it will give you, as we'll see in a moment, an informal test that you can bring to bear on arguments to check them for whether they're valid or not. Here's the first definition. An argument has a valid logical form when necessarily if the premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion is also true. Notice that this definition of validity does not require that the premises actually be true. Instead, the way we've defined it is conditionally. A valid argument is one such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would also be true. Here's a second way that actually is equivalent to this first definition. I find this one a little more intuitive. You should know both, but start with whichever one you find a little easier. The second definition of validity is this. It is impossible for the premises to be true and yet for the conclusion to be false. The first formulation of this definition says, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. The second definition, or the second way of formulating the definition, is this: there is no possible way for the premises of the argument to all be true, and yet somehow for the conclusion to be false. You can maybe begin to see the way in which, if an argument meets this definition, or either of these definitions of validity, that will give you a kind of movement from the truth of the premises to the truth of the conclusion. There is no possible way to grant the premises without being forced, as a matter of logic, to grant the conclusion as well. That is the power of a valid logical form. We will encounter lots of valid arguments in this class. Much of what we'll be doing in the next video is trying to work through a particularly difficult passage and determine whether or not we can construct a valid argument from the passage. For now, though, I want to give you a few examples. Here's one example of a valid argument. All Philosophy 2010 students love philosophy. Two, Sam is a Philosophy 2010 student. Now, I'm going to ask you to just pause for a second and think to yourself, what follows from this? What follows from these two premises? If all Philosophy 2010 students love philosophy, and Sam is a Philosophy 2010 student, well then it follows that, therefore, Sam loves philosophy. How can we tell that this is valid? That this has a good or tight logical form? Well, if these two premises were true, we don't really know whether they are yet. Maybe some of you haven't made up your mind as to whether or not you love philosophy. I actually haven't checked the roster to see if there's a Sam, so I'm not sure if there is or isn't a Sam in the class currently. However, the test is not, are these actually true? The test is, if they were true, is it still possible for that conclusion to be false? And what we can see is, if it were true that all Philosophy 2010 students love philosophy, if it were also true at the same time that Sam is a Philosophy 2010 student, it would have to be true that Sam loves philosophy. So there is an example of a logically valid argument. Notice that we didn't have to make any assumptions about whether the premises are actually true. So I stressed earlier that the truth of the premises and the goodness of the logic could come apart. Here's something for you to consider based on what I've said so far. Can a valid argument have false premises? You might initially think, well, no. I mean, if the argument's valid, then its logic is good, and if the logic is good, then the premises are true, right? And that's a little too hasty. In fact, a valid argument can have false premises, because validity is just about the logical structure of the argument. Here's an example. I don't know if we have any K-pop stans out there, but my first premise is this: all members of BTS are over 75 years old. So Jimin is over 75 years old, Jungkook is over 75 years old, Suga is over 75 years old, RM is over 75 years old, Jin is over 75 years old, RM is over 75 years old, and V is over 75 years old. That's all 7. That's our first premise. Premise 2, Joe Rogan is a member of BTS. Now, I'm going to ask you guys what follows. Again, often even though this is a video, my hope is that you'll take the opportunity to pause and think about these questions I'm asking before hearing the answer. Think to yourself, what follows from these two premises that I have so far? 1, all members of BTS are over 75, and 2, Joe Rogan is a member of BTS. You should be able to see, therefore, Joe Rogan is 75 years old. That follows from 1 and 2. That follows validly. That is, if it were true that premises 1 and 2 are true, then it would have to also be true that Joe Rogan is over 75 years old. Notice that as a matter of actual fact, premises and conclusion are all false. So what we've just demonstrated is that an argument can have a valid logical form despite having false premises and indeed having a false conclusion. How can that be? Well, go back to your definition of a valid argument. A valid argument is one such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion is also true. So if it were true that all members of BTS are over 75, in your mind's eye, imagine them all grizzled and gray, and if it were also true that Joe Rogan, for whatever reason, has joined as the 8th member of BTS, it would indeed follow, and it would be true that Joe Rogan's over 75, if we hold fixed those two assumptions. So the truth value of the premises and the logical structure of the argument are two separable things. Second question for you to consider. Can a valid argument, can an invalid argument have true premises? Well, again, you might initially be tempted to think, well, if it's invalid, then the logic's bad, so the premises have got to be false. That's not true, though. We've already encountered an example, actually, of an argument that has true premises, but that is logically invalid. That was argument B. Remember that argument B's first premise was UCF is in Florida. Its second premise is that dogs are mammals. And its conclusion was, therefore, God does not exist. Now, of course, we're not going to come to any kind of firm conclusion about the truth value of the conclusion, but for now, just focus on the fact that 1 and 2 are both true. Nevertheless, we can all see that this is a logically invalid argument because these premises just have nothing at all to do with whether the conclusion is true. So there we have an example of an invalid argument that has true premises. Part of what I'm just illustrating here is the way in which actual truth and falsity of the premises and then logical validity or invalidity can come apart. They don't always go hand in hand. What you need from a sound or good philosophical argument is that it meets both conditions. I'm going to give you a couple more questions to consider, and then we'll wrap up today's lesson with just a summary of what we've learned. So I'm not going to tell you what argument X is. That is, I'm not going to tell you the content of its premises or its conclusion. But here's what I will tell you. Argument X has true premises, and its conclusion is also true. Question: based on what I've just told you, do you know whether argument X is valid or invalid? You don't yet know, in fact, whether this is a valid or invalid argument. It could be that argument X has true premises, but a terrible logical form. For example, it could be that the first premise is UCF is in Indiana. Could be that the second premise is dogs bark, and perhaps the conclusion is grass is green. That would be true premises, true conclusion, but obviously, logically, a bad argument because those premises have nothing to do with that conclusion. Here's another example for you to consider. Argument Y. Argument Y, here again, I'm going to tell you a bit about it, but not everything about what the premises and the conclusion actually are. Argument Y's premises are actually true. Again, we don't know what those premises are. And here's one more thing that's really important about argument Y. it has a valid logical form. What else do you know, based on what I've just told you, about argument Y? Well, based on your knowledge of the definition of validity, here's the first thing you can conclude about argument Y. You can actually conclude two things about it. The first thing you can conclude is that Y's conclusion is true. How can you conclude such a thing when you don't even know the content of the conclusion? Well, recall that a valid argument is one such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. And what I've told you is that argument Y's premises are true. I've also told you that it's valid. So I've told you that necessarily if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. So you put those two together and what you get is, well, premises are actually true. And furthermore, if they're true, then so is the conclusion. I guess the conclusion is also true. So validity in this way, together with true premises, is what takes you from old knowledge to new knowledge. It's really the basis of rationality and good thinking. It's this movement from old truths by way of good logic to new truths. There's one other thing that we can learn just from what we've been told so far, one other thing we can conclude about this argument, and that is Y is sound. How can we conclude that? Well, we know that argument Y is valid, and we also know that argument Y has true premises. And those are the two conditions that are required for an argument to be sound. Let's sum up what we've learned so far. You should definitely write this down in your worksheet, fill in the chart at the end there. The relationship between truth and falsity on the one hand and validity and invalidity on the other is complex. But we can map out all of the possible relationships between these based on what we've said so far. Let's imagine that we have an argument that is both invalid and has false premises. What we can then conclude about that argument is that it's an unsound argument, because recall that a sound argument is one that is both valid and has true premises. So an argument that's logically invalid with also false premises fails both tests. It's bad in both ways. An invalid argument with true premises. Such an argument is still unsound. I mean, it's nice that it's got true premises, but truth don't count for much if they are not logically structured in the right way. And it's not, because the argument's invalid. What about a valid argument with false premises? Well, again, not sufficient for soundness. Because although the logic's good, the premises are false. There is only one condition under which we have a good or sound argument, and this is what we'll be going for in philosophy. As you construct your own arguments, this is what you should be striving, ideally, to give. Arguments that are sound. And sound arguments are both logically valid and have true premises. I hope that this has been helpful. These are some of the very basic tools of critical thinking, philosophical reasoning, and of logic that are going to be useful for you throughout this course, and my hope is also in life as you try to evaluate arguments for controversial positions for yourself. Thank you.